world. That made the EPA completely irrelevant. EPA has basically dug itself into a hole of becoming totally irrelevant to the decisions of major corporations, which are aligning themselves increasingly with the European standards. However, if you're a small operator in China or elsewhere in the spokes of the global economy, and you want to sell stuff to, you only care about the American market, the American and the African and Latin America market, you can manufacture goods that you could never sell in Europe, and that's what's happening.
You attended a number of meetings in Silicon Valley. Explain what you watched unfold there, Mark Schapiro.
Well, what we're talking about here is an enormous global shift in power. We are really talking about the notion that Americans think that we sort of set the tune, whether it's environment, whether it's economic policy, financial policy. There's still an idea that we are the ones setting the tune and everybody follows. And the power shift that I write about here and that I think is fascinating is the emergence of the European Union as an enormous economic and political force in the world. So I watched in Silicon Valley, for example, I sat in on these meetings where consultants came in from the European Union to explain to American engineers the changes that were being required in Europe to enable them to sell their products in Europe. These are the major name brand electronic firms, and I watched them explain. Starting in 6 months, you got to remove the lead, the mercury, the cadmium, and chromium, and synthetic flame retardants from your electronic products, and you could see the world changing in front of their faces. These are guys who design these things. They made all these great things we have in our pockets, in our homes, and on your desk here. And suddenly this new entity from far off in Brussels, in this case, the head of the EU, was dictating what was going to be inside them. It was a transformative moment, I think, and actually quite revealing of this kind of shifting global dynamic that we're in.
So you now have lobbyists not only going to Washington, they're going to Brussels.
Oh, yeah. They're on express flights to Brussels. K Street.
To do what?
To lobby. K Street, basically, K Street, of course, the center of American lobbying in Washington. When the Europeans began trying to do these things, trying to change the production system, or trying to protect people from some of the dangers of what's in these products, the U.S. chemical industry manufacturers, they began flooding Brussels with lobbyists. And what's happened, I've walked around the European Parliament, the European Commission, which is essentially the Congress and White House of the European Union, crudely put, are now surrounded by the Burstyn Marstellers, the Hill and Knowlton companies, all the lobbying firms that we've become so familiar with in America moved wholesale to Brussels and have launched essentially a transatlantic, very aggressive lobbying campaign. It's been fascinating. If you need a portrait at all of the change dynamic in the world, you can see where the action has moved. Now, one of the reasons the action moved there is because over the last 8 years, the only threat really coming to major corporate interests, the only major threat was coming from Brussels. Now we're in a somewhat different dynamic, of course, somewhat. I mean, we'll see what happens, still panning itself out. But those firms have not left. They are there. And if you go, the American Chamber of Commerce has a huge presence in Brussels. And what they've tried to do is actually lobby. What's interesting is you can't lobby in the same way in Europe that you can here. I mean, you don't have campaign contributions, so you can't do those whole things. And so the lobbying is a very different form. And I talked to actually some of the lobbyists, and they were kind of thrown off because you got all different languages. The lobbying is very different. The way you exert influence is very different. And to a great extent, a good deal of the American lobbying didn't work and has been causing backfires.
We have to break, but we want to come back to Mark Schapiro. His book is called Exposed: The Toxic Chemistry of Everyday Products and What's at Stake for American Power. I want to ask you about baby bottles. I want to ask you about bioengineered foods. That's coming up after break. Stay with us. Watch Over Me. That's the Newport Jazz All-Stars from 1966. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, and we're more than 40 years later. And the question is, who is watching over you? And do you need that when it comes to the products you consume or that you use? Our guest is Mark Schapiro. His book is called Exposed, The Toxic Chemistry of Everyday Products and What's at Stake for American Power. The issue of regulation is now being presented as, well, that's bad for business, and especially in these economically perilous times, people have to let up. Your response to that, Mark Schapiro?
I think that is a line that has been repeated so many times that it's almost tiresome to hear. However, people have begun believing it. There's something deep in the American psyche that says that it's we individuals in opposition to the government, and there's a very, I think, profound American sense that argument has plugged into over the last 2 decades. And so what I actually wanted to do in doing the book really was actually to see, all right, what happens when the government does get a little more intrusive into the marketplace? What happens when they start regulating? And what I found in Europe was that when the government came in and said, wait a minute, you can't use these substances in these products. We want you to do things otherwise. You want to find less toxic alternatives. Over and over again, I found that the industries didn't shrink. They didn't lose market share. In fact, there were a lot of new jobs created, many new markets, particularly, for example, in international trade. If you look at the emerging economies with the new middle class coming up in Brazil and South Africa and Korea and other countries that are now in play sort of between Europe and America, which direction they're going to go, are increasingly, the trade figures are showing moving in a European direction when it comes to many of these products. And so the interesting thing was actually to see the economic effects, because what happened in every one of the industries that I looked at here, and it's even a broader portrait, there have been not the economic collapse that we keep hearing about, but in fact the opposite. And so I really wanted to look at this dynamic and say, what happens when regulation happens? I think we've been operating with this ruse, and what I really enjoyed doing in the reporting was actually to see what happens. What's unusual now is that you have an economy that's comparable to America's. We've never had that before. That's a new phenomenon that is really just, I would say, about that's really just 3 years old or 4 years old. Since 2005, when the EU became a consolidated, really, truly integrated economy. So for the first time in history, we can actually see how these policies we've been discussing here in America actually work.
Well, staying on Europe, I want to play a clip of Stavros Dimas. He is on the European Commission for the Environment. He explained how tightening environmental and consumer safety regulations benefits the economy.
The medical expenses for chemicals-related diseases will be less. Medicines will not be needed. We shall not lose working hours, and the productivity will be better. So the overall benefits of FRITS will by far outweigh the cost to the industry.
And this is Alain Perroy, the Director General of the European Chemical Industry Council. He says in the long term, consumer safety regulations ultimately help the chemical industry.
It's true that the image of the chemical industry is not ranking first in public opinions because there are fears about chemicals, about the hazards. So if we can demonstrate through REACH that well-documented dossier about hazard, exposure and risk and proper risk management is in place or is improved, we can indeed enhance the confidence in chemicals.
Now, he speaks for the chemical industry. Yeah. Mark Schapiro, author of Exposed.
Yes, he does speak for the chemical industry.
It's interesting that he has an accent, yes, because I don't know if you would find American lobbyists for the chemical industry speaking like that.
No, you wouldn't. And actually what was really something is I talked to, not him personally, but somebody else in their organization in Europe, as well as the American Chemical Council. And what happened during the debates, there actually began to see a division between the European and American chemical industry. They started united, and they started actually launching, they launched a joint lobbying campaign, essentially, to stop what Europe was doing. And after about a year or two, they began to separate. You could actually see it happening as the